Christian movement supports the historicity of the empty tomb. I could go on, but I think that enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in this field, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Now, Richard's main objection to the empty tomb is that Paul didn't believe in the empty tomb. Paul supposedly thought that the resurrection body is a spiritual body wholly distinct from the corpse in the tomb. Now, if this is supposed to be an argument against the empty tomb, then there's a massive assumption lying just beneath the surface, namely that we have no early independent evidence for the empty tomb. But we've just seen 5 lines of such evidence. So even if Paul believed on theological grounds that a resurrection doesn't require an empty tomb, that does nothing to deny the historical fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty. In any case, the key issue here is not whether our resurrection bodies will be radically different from our present earthly bodies. Rather, the key question is, how does the resurrection body come to be? Is it by transformation of the earthly body, or by exchanging the earthly body for another body? Let me mention briefly 4 reasons to think that Paul believed in a transformation of the earthly body to the resurrection body. First, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is clearly speaking of intrinsic change, not exchange. The Greek verb alasso has the same range of meanings as our English word, change. Sometimes it means intrinsic change in a single subject. For example, we say to an old friend, "My, how you've changed." Sometimes it can mean exchange, as when we say, "I changed money at the airport." Now, as Richard himself says, when interpreting words and phrases, context is everything. When alasso is used as exchange, the verb typically takes a direct object or prepositional phrase. For example, in Romans 1:23, Paul says they exchanged the glory of God for images. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul never says we shall change bodies. Rather, he says, the trumpet will sound and we shall be changed. The passage only makes sense as intrinsic change. Second, Paul's verbs of sowing and raising have the same implicit subject. It is sown, it is raised. 4 times Paul repeats this. To escape the implication of numerical identity, Richard is forced to mistranslate the passage so that the verbs take different subjects. One is sown, one, that is another one, is raised. Thirdly, Paul's use of the pronoun this points to our mortal bodies or nature that must be changed. 4 times he says, this perishable must put on imperishability. This mortal must put on immortality, indicating the transformation that must take place in our mortal bodies. And fourth, Paul elsewhere speaks of the change that our mortal bodies will undergo in the resurrection. Philippians 3:21, he will change our lowly body to be similar to his glorious body. Romans 8:10 and 11, he who raised Christ from the dead will make alive your mortal bodies also. Romans 8:23, we await adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For these and other reasons, the vast majority of contemporary commentators agree that in the resurrection, Paul envisages a transformation of the earthly body. Accordingly, we can say, no corpse left behind. Fact number 3. On different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. This is a fact which is virtually universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars and by Richard as well for the following reasons. 1. Paul's list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances guarantees that such appearances occurred. Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to his chief disciple, Peter, then to the inner circle of disciples known as the 12, Then he appeared to a group of 500 disciples at once. Then to his younger brother James, who up to that time was apparently not a believer. Then to all the apostles. Finally, Paul adds, he appeared also to me at the time when Paul was still a non-believing persecutor of the early Jesus movement. Given the early date of Paul's information, as well as his personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances cannot be dismissed as unhistorical. And second, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of the appearances. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Thus, even the skeptical New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann concludes, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Finally, fact number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be humiliatingly executed by them as a criminal. 2, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. But then the obvious question arises, what caused them to believe such an un-Jewish and outlandish thing? Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, muses, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. N.T. Wright, an eminent New Testament historian, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, then, there are 4 facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars who have written on the subject: Jesus' burial, his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. That brings us then to the second major contention, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for given historical facts. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all of these tests. 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains all 4 of the facts before us. 2, it has great explanatory power. It explains each fact well. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as divine confirmation of those claims. 4, it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, that God exists, which I take to be established by the arguments of natural theology. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, in no way conflicts with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. I accept that belief as wholeheartedly as I accept the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, number 6, it far outstrips any rival theories in meeting conditions 1 to 5. No naturalistic hypothesis has attracted a great number of scholars. On the basis of what I've said, then, I think that the best explanation of the facts is the one that the original eyewitnesses gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. Today, the rational man can hardly be blamed if he concludes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle occurred.